Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The high country east of Red Bluff kept its own clock. Day began not with the sun, but with the creak of a pump handle, the rasp of a match, the rasping cough of cattle turning in their pens. Elias Boone rose before the light could find his windows, and moved through his cabin the way a blind man knows his home. The wood stove door swung open in his left hand. The coffee pot was 2 steps beyond the peg where his hat hung. The Bible waited on the mantel face down to mark last night's verse. Patch, his old brindled hound, lifted his head when Elias passed, and thumped the floorboards once with his tail. A greeting sufficient between working creatures. Elias ate standing cornbread from yesterday. A heel of cheese he sliced thin. Coffee, black enough to tan leather. He kept his meals that way on purpose. A man could put a longing into himself by sitting down too often to a table he set alone. He liked to think efficiency made him solitary, not sadness. Outside, the first hint of morning wind combed the grama grass, and the sky over the pine ridge wore a bruise of purple that would soon yellow into day. He stepped onto the porch with his boots unlaced and knelt to tie them, the leather warm from the hearth. Far off, the river muttered to itself. Closer, the cattle called low, patient sounds that said hay would be welcome. He filled the manger, checked the salt blocks, ran his palm along the fence rails where last winter's storms had twisted. The wire. When a calf nosed his pocket for a treat, Elias let the animal take 2 fingers' worth of grain and nothing more. Ranching, he believed, asked you to give steady and not spoil. It was the same creed he held for himself by full daylight. He had ridden the lower pasture line and set 3 post holes along the wash. Juniper, his bay Murray, stood hipshot while he tamped each pole and cinched new wire. She blinked her long lashes and exhaled in the way of a friend who knows when to let you work. At the creek, he checked the little dam he'd built of willow and stone, adjusting a branch with the casual tenderness of a man correcting a child's collar. When the sun lifted to noon and laid a hot hand on his shoulders, Elias watered Juniper, watered himself, and read the day in the small signs. A tuft of deer hair snagged on a fence staple, a smear of mud where a boot had slid on the far bank likely. One of the hands from the Collier place cutting across his land to save time. Elias felt the shape of annoyance rise and fall in him like a trout nosing the surface. He let it sink. The world had room, and time had a way of teaching men their boundaries. On the ride back, he angled toward the ridge to look in on the bee boxes he built from scrap boards. Yellow butterflies hovered in a wavering script above the clover near them, and the bees moved with such purpose that watching them steadied him. He was a man of purposes small and plain. He had not come west to make a fortune. He had come to make an honest living beside a river, and to stand the length of a day without feeling beholden to anything he could not name. Red Bluff knew a different story. In town they called him the Virgin Rancher, though never to his face. The name had taken root the way any hardy weed does. It fit the soil and didn't need much tending. Elias drank coffee and water, not whiskey. He played checkers on the feed sack barrel and went home at sundown. He nodded at women and tipped his hat and never asked one to walk with him by the river. To some, that set a man apart. To others, it set him above reproach. Elias considered the talk like weather something. That might be inconvenient, but rarely worth cussing. If he had reasons for his quiet ways, they were his to carry. Once, years back, he'd carried other reasons' blood in the dust. A father's rage gone mean in a saloon. A boy forced to drag a man he loved out into the wind so he would not choke. On his own sick, Elias was 16 then. He had decided that night to keep his mind as he kept his fences, taut, necessary, unbroken. The vow had taken him all the way to this cabin, these cattle, this life that looked simple from a distance, and proved exacting up close. Toward mid-afternoon, the heat rose and shivered. A hawk hung above the bluffs, then folded its wings and fell. When it climbed again, something small struggled in its claws, and Patch's ears pricked at the distant cry. Elias whistled once. The hound trotted back into shade and dropped with a sigh. They were both creatures who understood the mercy of cool ground. He might have spent the balance of the day mending harness in the shadow of the porch if the wind hadn't turned. When summer ends, the first change you feel is not cold, but the wrong kind of quiet. The junipers held their breath. The grass stilled and flattened as if a giant palm pressed it. Elias felt the hairs on his forearms rise. He looked up and saw the mountains in a harder relief, every notch and ledge dark as ink. The weather wanted to break. He set aside the harness, rolled a tarp over the hay, and walked the fence once more, listening. That was when he heard the sobbing dot at first. It threaded itself through the wind like a bird you couldn't place. A sound not meant for human ears, far enough away that a man might dismiss it. Elias stopped dead. Patch stood too, his muzzle pointed west, one paw lifted. The cry came again, broken by breathing that had gone panicked. Elias moved without thinking, like a man whose body remembers a drill before his mind catches up. Stay, he told Patch, though the dog had never yet obeyed that word, and slid his rifle from its pegs. He didn't want it for shooting. He wanted the fact of it, the shape of resolve in his hands. He swung into the saddle and urged Juniper into a lope along the fence, then out through the gate and up the narrow trail that stitched the ridge. The sobbing fell off, then came back, as if fear itself were ducking and rising through the brush. The trail kinked around a boulder and broke into shale. Juniper picked her way, balanced like a dancer. Elias dismounted and led her the last 50 yards. The sound was close now, behind a clutch of scrub oak that clung to a dry gully as if it were a river. He eased the branches aside with his forearm, keeping the rifle down along his leg, where it would not frighten whatever waited. She was small first, and then she was a person. A child crouched under the oaks, knees to chest, her dress made from tanned deer hide the color of sand. 2 black braids fell to her shoulders. Both were full of burrs that bit his fingers when he later lifted them free. Dust had painted her cheeks, and tear tracks had cut 2 pale roads on either side of her nose. Her moccasins were scuffed, and one sole had split across so that her toes looked out at him like shy creatures from a den. When she saw him, she froze. He saw the tendons in her neck stand out. She did not scream. She made herself smaller. Trick animals and children learn when the world comes too close. Elias let the branches go and stepped back a pace so she could see him whole. He set the rifle down on the ground and moved his hands away from it, palms open. The afternoon leaned over the ridge and made the gully cooler. He felt the weather coming in that faint metallic way you can taste in your teeth. "Hello," he said softly, as if the word needed to find its footing. He knew a handful of words from the peoples who summered near the river, traded with them, shared water, kept distances where they were asked. The word for child came to him. Uzi. He tried it, gentle. Her eyes flicked to his mouth and back to his hands. She didn't answer. He eased down to his heels the way a man lowers himself to a campfire. He means to warm, but not burn. Lost? He put the question into his face more than his voice, sweeping. His hand along the surrounding brush, and then tapping his chest, then pointing toward the west, where the foothills sloped away into the country where her people camped. Home? He drew a house in the air, because there is no real house on. Open land, only the shape of belonging. She sniffed. Her breathing steadied. One of her hands, small, dirt-scored, came away from her knees. She mimed picking berries from a bush and dropping them into a basket on her hip. She pointed uphill, then made a motion like the basket tipping, the fruit spilling, her looking after it, and frowned. It was a good story for someone with no shared words. It said, "I wandered. I looked away. The world turned and I did not know it." Elias nodded. He took off his hat and set it on the ground between them, a small sunlit island. He unstoppered his canteen and placed it atop the hat so that to take one was to take both, a trade he hoped would feel right. "Water," he said, and took a siding of his own so she would not fear poison. After a small forever, she reached out and took the canteen with both hands. The way she drank told him how long she had walked. He cracked the leather pouch at his belt and put 2 strips of jerky on the hat, too. She sniffed them, looked up at him a last time like a question, then ate as if convinced by something she had read in his face. "Name?" he asked after a while and touched his own chest. "Elias." He spoke it slowly and felt foolish and tender at once. She touched her breastbone. "Ioka," she whispered, the word shaped like a creek running over flat stones. She said it again, then a third time, as if giving him a gift that required both hands. "Ioka," he repeated, and she nodded. Pride changed her mouth for. A moment before the worry returned. The wind had climbed out of the ravine and run off ahead of the weather, and the sky had gone the color of a tin cup. Elias looked at the ridge. He could see his lined shack from here if he squinted, a gray seam in the pines. Darkness would take the trail in an hour. He pictured trying to find a camp he didn't know in a country where he would be a stranger and a trespasser, carrying a child under a storm sky. He pictured leading her here with a blanket and a fire, and the wolf music of night coming down around her like teeth. The 2 pictures stood side by side, and one of them made him feel like a man he would not want to meet. "We go," he said. He pointed to Juniper, who had waited without complaint at the edge of the brush, her ears turning to every sound like small living compasses. He set his rifle back in its scabbard. He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around Ioka's shoulders. It dwarfed her, and she sank into it like a bird disappears into a hedge. Ioka flinched when he took a step toward her, then stilled. He held out his hand and did not move it. She looked at it as if it were a new sort of tool she had not seen made before. Then she slid her hand into his. He felt the chill of her fingers, even through the work-stiff callus of his own palm. The climb back to the trail took them through a tangle of scrub. Twice a branch caught at Ioka's braids and pulled her up short, and each time Elias untangled the burrs as if arranging reins. He did not speak while he worked, but she watched him with the alertness of a rabbit in tall grass. On the trail, he lifted her light as a sack of seed into the saddle. Juniper breathed out once, a slow acceptance, and set her feet. They stood that way for a moment, a rancher with the dusk at his back, a child wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big, a mare reading the weather. Elias looked toward the west. If they rode hard before the rain, they could make the flat where the cottonwoods began. He knew the river there. He did not know the camps beyond, but he knew what it meant to carry a person from danger toward home. That had to be enough for the first step. He put his boot in the stirrup. Before he swung up, he thought of Red Bluff, of the checkerboard, and the men who measured one another's lives in empty glasses and loud laughter. He imagined someone asking him what business he had with a child not his own, with a people not his own. He imagined the word they used for him, the small mean pleasure it gave them, and felt it lose all weight. The world had offered him the chance to be useful, and his soul, simple and exacting, could not bear to refuse. He mounted behind Ioka and gathered the reins. Patch, who had, of course, followed them despite the order to stay, pressed his shoulder against Juniper's hock and looked up with the expression of a partner waiting for instructions he will carry out before you finish giving them. Home, Elias said, not sure whether the word was for the girl or for himself, and touched his heels to the mare. Juniper stepped forward. The first fat drops of rain found the brim of his hat and lifted the dust smell from the trail, a sudden green scent that made the whole country taste alive. Somewhere beyond the ridge, in a valley he had never walked, a mother counted minutes. Unlike any other minutes a person can count. That was where they were riding. Behind them, the river deepened its mutter. Ahead of them, the land fell away into a dimming map neither of them could read yet. Elias fixed his eyes on the low place, where the cottonwoods would stand like a broken comb against the sky, and let the mare choose her footing. He would borrow the night and give it back. He would cross lines and then ask forgiveness. He would learn the word for thank you, and the one for safe, and the one for daughter. He did not know that by morning the open ground outside his cabin would be black with riders. He only knew the simple truth that had governed his days since he was a boy. A person is found. You carry them home. The storm shouldered down over the ridge, and they rode into it together. The rain came fast and without ceremony. By the time Elias and Ioka reached the low flats, the sky had ripped itself open, and the mare's hide shone slick with water. Elias leaned forward, steadying the girl with one arm while keeping the yaw, reins loose in the other hand. The trail, if it had ever been one, was now a slick ribbon of clay. Juniper picked her way like a creature that understood the weight on her back meant more than herself. Ioka did not cry. She sat rigid in Elias's coat, her eyes wide as lanterns in the storm. Now and again she pointed west, small hand darting from the folds of the coat like a sparrow breaking cover. Elias followed each gesture, adjusting their course around mesquite, thickets and shallow gullies that had turned to torrents. The rain plastered his hair against his temples and stung his eyes, but he said nothing. He was not a man given to words, and now, with a child who shared none of his tongue, silence became a bridge rather than a wall. They pushed on through darkness that seemed to come hours early. When the worst of the downpour eased, the air smelled of iron and juniper smoke. Elias knew then they were close to camps. No wildfire burned in such steady lines. He stopped Juniper on a rise and peered down into the valley. Pinpricks of orange glowed through the mist. Campfires set in rings, their smoke curling flat under the heavy sky. Shapes moved around them, men and women tending pots, tying shelters against the rain. Ioka stirred at the sight. She sat taller, a first warmth of recognition touching her face. She tugged at Elias's sleeve and pointed more urgently now toward a cluster of fires near the river's bend. Elias's throat tightened. He had walked cattle near tribal boundaries before, traded pelts for cornmeal, and nodded respectful distances at riders who studied him with hawk eyes. But never had he crossed into the heart of a camp. White men who did such things often didn't return. Yet to turn back now was to abandon the child, and that Elias could not do. He spoke low to Juniper. "Steady, girl." Then he nudged her. Down the slope dot, as they drew closer, the camp grew sharp. Hides stretched between poles, shadows cast tall and shifting by firelight, dogs trotting and barking. The first figures appeared between the sheltersmen, with long braids and painted faces, boughs strung tight in their hands. A sharp cry went up, answered by others. Torches flared. In an instant, Elias and the girl were surrounded. Juniper stamped, but did not rear. Elias kept both hands high, reins dangling loose. The rain had washed the dust from his coat and left him looking less like a rancher, more like a ghost risen from the dark earth. "I brought her," he said slowly, voice pitched to carry but not challenge. He nodded toward Ioka, who clung to him with one small fist in his shirt. She was lost. "By the creek, I brought her." The words hung heavy. None answered. The men's faces were unreadable, carved from shadow and fire. Spears angled toward him like a forest grown in a heartbeat. Then a cry rose from the deeper circle of tents, a woman's voice. Ayoka's head snapped up. She wriggled against Elias's arm, slipping down before he could stop her. The child ran, stumbling once in the mud, then straight into the arms of a woman who fell to her knees with a sound that broke the silence of warriors. The woman clutched her daughter, sobbing into her hair. Around them, voices lifted, women calling Ayoka's name, children pressing close, men lowering their weapons, but not their eyes. Elias sat astride Juniper, hat dripping, hands still raised. He knew better than to move first. His heart beat hard enough that he felt it in his throat. He wondered if this was the last moment of his life, the kindness of bringing her home. Outweighed by the trespass of entering the camp, not an elder pushed through the gathering. He was tall, his hair silvered, his eyes like flint. He wore a blanket of dark wool across his shoulders, rain pooling and running from it as if it were part of him. He stopped before Elias, looking up into his face with a gaze that stripped. Away pretense not the elder spoke in his own tongue, long and measured. Elias caught none of the words, but the cadence held judgment, weighty as the storm itself. When the elder finished, he turned to the gathered warriors, and they stepped back. Giving him space. Slowly, the elder raised a hand and touched his chest. Then he pointed to Ayoka, safe in her mother's arms. Finally, he let his hand fall toward Elias, as if drawing a line that connected them. The gesture was spare, but impossible to mistake. He saw what had been done. Elias bowed his head. He wanted to say, "You're welcome," but knew no word would serve. Instead, he touched his hat brim, the closest thing he owned to reverence. Elder held his eyes for a long breath, then inclined his head once. Not thanks, not forgiveness, something in between, heavier. A dog barked. Children laughed nervously. The circle of warriors broke apart, some returning to their fires, others melting into the night. The storm eased. Elias felt the tension leak from his shoulders, though he did not move until the elder stepped aside. He turned Juniper, the mare's hooves splashing through puddles, and rode back up the rise. At the edge of hearing, the camp's voices swelled. Again, full of relief, of family restored. He let the sound follow him into the night. By the time he reached his own cabin, the storm had passed. The sky opened, black and endless. Stars hammered across it. Elias unsaddled Juniper and rubbed her down by lantern light. Patch, who had kept a wary distance in the camp, curled up again by the fire as though nothing had happened. Elias brewed coffee, though the hour was near dawn. He drank it standing, boots still wet, coat still dripping. He thought of the elder's eyes, the weight of silence that had passed between them. He told himself the matter was ended now. He had done his part. Tomorrow he would mend fences and check his herd, and life would return to the measured rhythm he had always kept. But when he lay down at last, sleep did not come easy. His dreams were full of hoofbeats, of firelit faces watching, and of the small hand that had gripped his sleeve in the storm. And in those dreams, a shadow gathered on the horizon, vast and waiting. Not the usual kind, no. This was the kind of silence that made even the birds forget their songs. A thin mist clung to the valley, but the air was too still, too heavy. Patch, his brindled hound, stood at the door of the cabin with hackles raised, a low growl caught in his throat. Juniper snorted nervously in the corral, pacing in a tight circle, ears pinned to some sound Elias could not yet hear. Elias pulled on his boots and stepped outside, mug of coffee still in his hand. He had lived long enough on this land to know when something was wrong, and what he saw made the blood in his chest slow. Below the ridge, spread across the wide flats like a dark carpet. 300 horsemen sat their mounts in perfect silence. Their numbers blackened the valley floor. Spears and rifles caught the first pale light of dawn. Feathers shifted in the breeze. Metal glinted like ice. The warriors did not move. They did not speak. The only sound was the restless stamp of hooves. On the damp earth-top Elias felt the weight of that sight like a stone on his shoulders. He had heard stories in Red Bluff, in the saloon corners, where men whispered about raids and massacres, about sudden thunder at dawn. He had dismissed most as talk meant to puff up fear. But now, with 300 silent riders before his cabin, the stories came alive, and he knew how small a man could be when the land itself seemed to have turned against him. Patch barked, once sharp and defiant, before Elias quieted him with a hand. He set down the coffee, though his fingers trembled just enough to spill it into the dirt. He did not reach for his rifle. What good would it be against such a gathering? Instead, he placed his hat on his head and walked forward, boots crunching. On gravel, every step sounding far too loud in the hush-dot, he stopped 10 paces from his porch, where the open ground fell toward the flats. The warriors sat in ranks like trees in a forest, their faces painted, unreadable. Some carried bows, others rifles taken from battles long past. All eyes were on him. The ranks parted. Slowly, a single rider moved forward. The horse was black and broad-shouldered, its breath steaming in the morning chill. The man upon it was the elder Elias had seen the night before, the one whose gaze had held him like iron. He wore the same dark blanket, though now the storm had dried it. His hair gleamed silver, his face set as if carved from stone. The elder reined in before Elias, dismounted, and stood tall. Behind him, 300 men did not so much as shift in their saddles. The silence was deeper than any church Elias had ever entered. For a long moment, the two men regarded one another. Elias felt the pulse in his neck hammer, but he did not lower his gaze. He remembered the girl's face, the way she had clung to her mother. That memory steadied him. The elder spoke at last in slow, broken English, each word as deliberate as a stone laid in a wall. "You found child." His voice carried easily over the distance, neither harsh nor soft. "You brought her." Elias swallowed, then nodded once. "Yes, I found her lost, and I brought her back." The elder's dark eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in the way a man studies another to measure his truth. He lifted his hand and motioned toward the valley. At once, the line of riders struck their spear shafts and rifle butts against the ground in unison. The thunder of it rolled up the ridge, shaking the boards of Elias's cabin, making Juniper rear in the corral. The sound was not battle. It was something older, heavier, like the heartbeat of the land itself. When it ended, silence returned with the sharpness of a blade. The elder took another step closer. "You came at night. No fear, no bargain, only give." He tapped his chest once, then pointed to Elias. "We see." Elias did not know what answer was expected of him. His mouth was dry, his voice rough. When he spoke, any man would have done the same. But even as he said it, he knew that was not true. Men he knew in Red Bluff would have turned away. Some would have taken the child captive, a pawn in a game too cruel to name. Some would have left her for coyotes. The elder's eyes told him that too. The elder looked past Elias, at the cabin, at the corral, at the life built with quiet labor. Then he spoke again. "We stand here, 300. You alone." He let the words hang, the meaning plain. "Now we know. You are seen." Then he raised his hand. Once more, the warriors struck the earth as one. The ground shook. The air seemed to vibrate in Elias's bones. Then, like mist dissolving under the sun, the riders wheeled their horses and began to move away. not in disorder, not in haste. They rode as one body, a tide receding, their silence as commanding as their arrival. In minutes, the valley that had been black with horsemen lay empty again, save for the trampled grass and the faint echo of hooves. Elias stood alone in the dawn, his dog pressed against his leg, his mare snorting in the corral. His coffee lay, spilled in the dust. He exhaled a breath he did not know he'd been holding. The elder's words echoed in his ears. "You are seen, Dot." It was not a threat, not a blessing. It was something larger, something that made Elias understand that his quiet, solitary life was no longer invisible. Somewhere beyond the ridges, 300 warriors carried his name in silence, and that was a weight heavier than any herd or fence line he had ever tended. The valley lay quiet again, as if the riders had never been there at all. Only the trampled grass remained, pressed flat by the hooves of 300 horses. Elias stood at the edge of his porch, hat in hand, staring at that empty place. Patch leaned against his leg, whining softly, while Juniper tossed her head in the corral, still unsettled. Elias had thought he wanted solitude. For years he had lived it, his life measured in fence posts driven, calves birthed, fields mended after flood or frost. His neighbors in Red Bluff whispered about his strangeness, called him the virgin rancher, because they could not understand. A man who kept to himself. But this new kind of solitude, after 300 men had ridden to his door and thundered their spears in the ground, felt different. He was alone now, yes, but no longer unseen. That day passed in a haze. Elias moved through his chores automatically. He scattered hay, milked his one cow, patched a saddle strap that had been wearing thin for weeks. Yet every task carried the echo of hoofbeats. Every time he lifted his eyes to the horizon, he half expected to see the line of warriors still, there waiting. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know that silence was never empty. Silence meant something. Toward dusk, Elias sat on the porch with his Bible in his lap. He tried to read, but could not keep the letters straight. His mind returned again and again to the elder's words, "You are seen." It was not a blessing, but neither was it a warning. It was a bond, spoken in the only language they could both share. He wondered what the people of Red Bluff would say if they knew. They would demand to know why 300 warriors had spared him, why they had not set his cabin aflame. They would ask if he had bargained, or if he had bent knee to them. They would not understand that sometimes the strongest agreements are made in silence, and that no coin, no whiskey, no powder or blood need change hands. Night fell heavy. The stars returned, bright and countless. Elias lit a lantern and carried it to the barn. Inside, the air smelled of hay and horses, safe and familiar. He leaned against Juniper's flank, listening to the steady sound of her chewing. The mare turned her head, brushed his sleeve with her muzzle, and sighed. That sound loosened the knot in his chest more than any prayer could have. Days passed. No riders returned. Yet their absence weighed as much as their presence had. Elias felt it in the way game crossed his land without fear, in the way his cattle grazed undisturbed by rustlers who once prowled the valley. Once he found a bundle of fresh fish laid on a rock near the creek, wrapped in woven reeds. Another morning, he discovered his fence mended where the posts had sagged. He had not touched it. He had not seen who had. But the work was done, clean and careful. The message was plain. He was under their watch. The oath of silence was not broken, but it was felt in every gesture. At first, the weight of it troubled him. A man who had lived alone so long did not easily welcome unseen hands in his life. He paced the porch at night, rifle across his knees, scanning the ridge for shadows. But nothing came. No arrow, no torch, no threat. Only the steady, invisible presence of people who had judged him and decided he was worthy of their protection. One evening, weeks later, Elias rode into Red Bluff for supplies. The men in the saloon greeted him with the usual nods, the half-mocking questions about his solitude. He listened without reply. He bought flour, salt, and lamp oil, then turned to go. On his way out, he caught a pair of ranchers whispering about stock gone missing in the hills, about how the tribes were restless again. Elias said nothing, but inside, he knew their unease would never touch him, because he was seen, because 300 men had stood in silence outside his cabin and thundered their vow into the earth. Back at his ranch, Elias resumed his quiet life, but it was no longer the same solitude. When he rode the fence lines, he felt eyes on him, watchful, not hostile. When he prayed at night, he felt the prayer rise not only to the God of his father, but also into the wide silence of the hills where another kind of covenant had been made. Seasons turned. The river froze and thawed. Calves were born and fattened. Elias grew older, the beard silvering at his jaw, his hands roughened further by work. But he never forgot the morning when the valley floor had gone dark with riders, when silence had spoken louder than any word. Years later, men in Red Bluff would still call him the Virgin Rancher. They would still think of him as a loner, a man set apart. None of them ever knew why rustlers left his herd untouched, or why raiding parties skirted his land as if it carried a mark invisible to white men. But the people in the hills remembered. They told the story of a child found and returned by a man with no greed in him. They told of 300 warriors who rode in silence to bear witness, and of the oath given on that dawn, that his cabin would stand, his herds would live, his name would be guarded by the valley itself. And Elias Boone, though he never sought it, became more than a rancher. He became a legend of two peoples, bound not by blood or by law, but by the quiet strength of a single act of kindness.